Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The sky tore open, a wound in the fabric of reality itself, its edges seething with fire and shadow. From the breach came the ships, not in a violent, haphazard descent, but with the slow inevitability of a tide rolling in to claim the shore. Their hulls were blacker than the void that had birthed them, drinking in the light, turning midday to twilight. Earth had long speculated about the existence of extraterrestrial life. Scientists theorized, governments whispered, fiction dreamed. But nothing had prepared humanity for the unthinkable. Not only were they not alone, but they were prey. The Zarathians did not arrive as explorers, nor even as conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not demand surrender. They did not issue ultimatums. They simply arrived, and in doing so, declared dominion. Their first strike was not one of fire and destruction, but of silence. Entire networks, military, civilian, financial, collapsed within minutes, as though the world's very nervous system had been severed. Satellites, the sentinels of human progress, were crushed by unseen forces, falling like dead birds into the oceans. Cities flickered once, then fell dark, street by street, window by window, until the planet lay still beneath the weight of an intelligence so vast, so advanced, that resistance seemed almost laughable. Then came a sound. It did not burst forth from the heavens, nor did it travel through air in a way that could be recorded or studied. It arrived directly inside the minds of every living being, bypassing ears, bypassing thought, speaking not in words, but in something deeper, more fundamental. A command written in the marrow of consciousness. You will kneel. You will serve. You will become useful. There was no inflection, no threat, no cruelty, just inevitability, spoken as though it were a law of the universe. And so, humanity fell. It was not war, because war required two sides to fight. It was not even conquest. It was the cold, mechanical process of subjugation, an algorithm executing itself upon an unprepared species. The streets filled not with bodies, but with the collapsed forms of men and women who had simply ceased. Their muscles no longer theirs, their minds shackled by an intelligence beyond their comprehension. And yet, on a rooftop in what had once been New York, a man did not fall. Elias Carter felt the force of it like a fist driving into his skull. His vision blurred. His body screamed to comply. He tasted blood, his own, running from his nose, his ears hot against the cold press of alien will. His knees trembled. The world around him shrank to a tunnel of agony. But he did not kneel. He did not know why. He was not a soldier. He was not special. He had lived an ordinary life, waking up to alarms he had grown to resent, working a job he did not love, filling the quiet moments with distractions that never truly satisfied. And yet, when the moment came, the moment where something greater than him, something vast and ancient and unknowable, demanded his submission, he found himself gripping the edge of the rooftop, refusing. The weight intensified. The pulse of alien control surged like a tide crashing against a stubborn rock, seeking to erode, to break, to drown. He choked on his breath, his lungs seizing, his vision narrowing further. His body was failing. He would die rather than kneel. And yet, he was not alone. Below, scattered like debris across the streets, others stirred. A woman in a business suit, her hands trembling against the pavement. A teenager, clutching his skull, shaking but awake. It was small, so small, a ripple against an ocean. But the Zarathians had never seen a ripple before. For the first time, they hesitated. Elias could not see them. He did not know what they looked like, whether they had eyes, mouths, faces at all. But he felt their attention shift. Not just to him, to all of them. The ones who had resisted. The anomalies. And then the pressure returned tenfold. It was no longer a passive force, no longer an assumption of compliance. This was targeted, sharpened, honed into a spear aimed at the fragile human mind. Blood vessels burst in the eyes of those who had resisted. The woman in the business suit fell, screaming. The teenager collapsed, shaking uncontrollably. The air itself wavered, as though reality itself bent under the pressure of a mind too vast to comprehend. Elias dropped to one knee. His head threatened to split apart, the world narrowing to a pinpoint of light and sound. His body was not meant to withstand this. His brain was not built to fight it. And yet, even as the darkness closed in, as his body betrayed him, his lips parted, and he whispered two words. "Make me." The pressure faltered. It was almost imperceptible, a shift so minor it could have been imagined. But Elias felt it. He felt the weight hesitate, the force, so absolute, so unchallenged, stumble for the briefest of moments. And in that moment, something changed. Not in him, not in the Zorathians, in the equation itself. Because for the first time in all their long history, they had encountered something new. A variable they had not accounted for. And variables have a way of unraveling even the most perfect calculations. The Zorathian did not move. It lay in the street like a broken thing, its once fluid form stiff and unnatural, as if frozen mid-transition between states. The air around it shimmered, rippling like heat distortion, flickering between the physical and something else entirely. Its edges still pulsed with brief, erratic spasms, the corruption spreading through its structure like a sickness. Elias Carter did not move either. He did not breathe, did not blink. He watched. He had expected many things in the last hour, expected to be crushed beneath the weight of an intelligence beyond comprehension, expected to die in the street like so many others. But he had not expected this. The Zorathians did not fail. They did not hesitate. They did not break. And yet one had. The woman beside him stirred, a sharp inhale that sounded too loud in the suffocating silence. She had seen it too, had watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. She wasn't the only one. The city lay in eerie stillness, a graveyard of the fallen. Thousands of bodies littered the streets, unmoving, some twitching in the aftershocks of the suppression waves. But there were more now, more than just Elias and the woman, who were shifting. The air carried the quiet, disoriented gasps of others waking, breaking free. The Zorathians had miscalculated, and in that miscalculation, something had cracked. The woman exhaled, slow and measured, as if she too feared that any sound would shatter this fragile moment of uncertainty. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, raw from whatever had been done to them. What just happened? Elias had no answer. He could still feel it, the residue of their command, the expectation of submission that had been woven into his thoughts. It was still there, like a ghost of something vast and all-encompassing. But it no longer held him. His eyes flicked down to his hands, fingers still trembling. The blood, the ache in his skull, the weight pressing against his thoughts, it had not left. And yet, he was here, awake, aware, not kneeling. A sound, not from the woman, not from the bodies littering the street, from a Zorathian. It twitched again, sharper this time, its form convulsing in short, violent jerks. The distortion around it intensified, flickering like a failing signal, the edges of its body stuttering between solidity and nothingness. Elias felt his breath catch. Then it spoke, not in words, not in sound, in thought. A voice crawled into his mind, alien and vast, but fractured. It did not command. It did not impose. It struggled. System breach, corruption, error. Each word, or what passed for words, was jagged, fragmented, slipping in and out of coherence. The weight behind them was wrong, unstable, as though whatever force had once powered them was now fraying, unraveling. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the Zorathian's body went still. The distortion faded. The pulsing stopped. Silence. Elias swallowed. The woman beside him let out a slow, shuddering breath. He turned to her, scanning her face for the first time, properly seeing her. Pale skin, dark hair streaked with dust and sweat, wide eyes that burned with something sharp beneath the exhaustion. She looked like she had spent years fighting something no one else could see. He should have asked her name, should have introduced himself. But none of that mattered now. "What did you hear?" he asked instead. She hesitated, lips pressing into a tight line, as if unwilling to put it into words. Then, finally, she whispered, "Error." Elias felt something cold coil in his gut. Not pain, not fear, understanding. The Zarathians were not gods. They were not infallible. They were something worse. They were machines. No, not machines in the way humans understood them, not metal and circuits, not something that could be dismantled with a wrench. They were something greater, something woven from thought and matter, something that had shaped itself into what it needed to be. But at their core, they followed rules. And rules could be broken. The woman shifted, glancing down at the unmoving body of the Zarathian. "Is it dead?" Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure it could die, at least not in the way humans did. It had collapsed, its form failing, its signal corrupted. But death implied an ending, a finality. And this felt like something unfinished, something interrupted. The thought sent a fresh pulse of adrenaline through his system. He exhaled sharply and pushed himself to his feet. His legs still trembled, unsteady beneath him, but he forced them to hold. The woman followed suit, slower, wincing as she straightened. She was still struggling against the aftermath of the suppression waves, just as he was. They had no time to recover. Another sound reached them, distant but growing. A low, mechanical hum. Not the weight of the Zarathians will pressing into their thoughts, but something else. Engines. Above them, the vast ships that still loomed over the city began to shift. Not much. Not enough to signal panic, but enough to notice. They had seen. They had felt it, and they would not allow it to continue. Elias inhaled sharply. "We need to move." The woman didn't question him. She simply nodded, jaw tight, fingers curling into fists as if steadying herself. But before they could take their first step, something shifted below them. The Zarathian. Its form twitched, not in the erratic, corrupted spasms from before. This was different, controlled. Elias barely had time to register the movement before the thing spoke. The voice was no longer fragmented, no longer broken. It slithered into his thoughts, cold and calculated. "We have seen you." Elias felt his pulse stutter. "You will be found." Then the Zarathian's body collapsed in on itself, flickering between states, vanishing into nothing. Gone. Silence. Elias turned to the woman. She met his gaze, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. No words were needed. They had been seen, and the hunt had begun. The subway tunnel swallowed them whole. Elias stepped carefully over the broken concrete, the damp air thick with the scent of rust and decay. His boots scraped against the uneven ground, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness stretching before them. The girl moved ahead without hesitation, her small form barely more than a shadow in the dim light. The woman followed, her pace steady but reluctant. Every step weighted with unspoken tension. Darkness loomed beyond the entrance, swallowing what little light filtered through the shattered remnants of the city above. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. The slow, rhythmic patter, the only sign that time had not completely stopped in this forsaken place. Elias adjusted his footing, glancing back toward the subway entrance. The world above was still visible, a jagged wound in the ceiling, fractured beams jutting out like broken ribs. Through it, he could see the sky, heavy with the silent presence of Zarathian ships. They had not descended further. Not yet, but he could feel them. Watching, waiting, the child led them deeper. The further they went, the colder it became. The air felt heavy, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to keep his thoughts from spiraling. The walls of the tunnel bore the scars of collapse. Jagged cracks ran along the tile. Metal beams bent inward where something massive had crushed its way through. Trains, once meant to carry thousands of lives through the veins of the city, lay twisted and forgotten, their skeletal remains buried in debris. The girl moved with purpose, slipping between wreckage, her steps practiced, sure. She had done this before. Elias exchanged a glance with the woman beside him. She had not spoken much since they had begun their descent, but the tension in her shoulders had not eased. She didn't trust this. Neither did he. Still, they followed. The tunnels stretched on in eerie silence. The only sounds their own movements, the distant trickle of water, the occasional creak of shifting metal settling in the dark. The girl never slowed, never second-guessed her path. It was as if she could navigate the ruins blind. Then up ahead, light. Not the cold, sterile glow of the outside world. Not the flickering remnants of street lamps barely clinging to life. But something warm, controlled. The girl glanced back at them, her expression unreadable. "We're here." Elias hesitated. The woman tensed. But the girl had already moved ahead, disappearing around the bend. Elias followed, pulse quickening as he stepped into the unknown. The tunnel opened into a larger space. A platform, partially caved in but still intact. And it was occupied. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms half-lit by makeshift lanterns strung haphazardly along the broken infrastructure. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, men and women in ragged clothing, faces lined with exhaustion, eyes sharp with suspicion. Some stood. Others sat against the remains of an old bench, their postures guarded but not immediately hostile. Elias's muscles coiled instinctively, every nerve on edge. The woman beside him stiffened, but she did not move to run. Not yet. The girl stopped just short of the others and turned back toward them. "They're not controlled," she said simply. A man stepped forward. He was older, maybe mid-40s, lean but strong, his face weathered with lines that spoke of experience rather than age. His gaze swept over Elias first, assessing, then moved to the woman. "And you know this how?" His voice was low, edged with suspicion. The girl crossed her arms. They didn't collapse when the waves hit. A murmur passed through the gathered survivors. Elias felt the weight of a dozen gazes settle on him. He exhaled slowly. "She's right," he said. "We resisted." The man studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the woman. "Both of you." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze evenly. "We're still standing, aren't we?" Another murmur. Someone shifted near the edge of the group. A woman, younger, her clothes torn, eyes dark with something unreadable. "You're not the first," she said. Elias turned toward her. "What do you mean?" The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "A few others have shown up in the past day. People who should have been taken, but weren't. We don't know why." Elias felt something stir in his chest. A flicker of something dangerous. "Hope." "How many?" The man hesitated. The girl answered first. Seven. Not many, but not nothing." The woman beside Elias shifted slightly. He could tell she was calculating the same thing he was. If there were others, then this wasn't a fluke. It wasn't just them. The Zarathians had miscalculated, and miscalculations could be exploited. A figure moved near the back of the platform. Elias hadn't noticed them at first, tucked away in the shadows, silent. But now they stepped forward, and something about the way the others tensed made Elias do the same. A man, younger than the first speaker, but older than Elias. His build was lean, wiry muscle, his clothes layered in a way that suggested both practicality and preparedness. His gaze locked onto Elias with something that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't trust either. "You were seen," he said. The room went still. Elias's fingers curled into fists. He didn't ask how the man knew. He had felt at the moment the Zarathian collapsed. They had been marked. The man took another step forward. "If they saw you, they'll come for you. And if they come for you, they come for us." Elias forced himself to hold the man's gaze. "Then maybe we should be the ones to move first." Silence. The woman beside him let out a sharp breath. "You want to fight them?" Elias shifted his weight, pulse steady despite the tension curling in his gut. "I want to know why we resisted," he said, "and if there's a way to do it again." Another silence, longer this time. Then, to Elias's surprise, the man smiled. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't joy. It was something sharper. Recognition. "You might just fit in here," he said. The girl exhaled, shaking her head. "Told you they weren't controlled." The man nodded once, then gestured toward the platform's far side. "You should get some rest. You won't get much of it soon." Elias glanced at the woman. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something other than quiet calculation in her eyes. A shared understanding. Neither of them had planned on this. But plans no longer mattered. The world had already ended. Now, it was time to decide what came next. Sleep did not come easily. Elias lay on a thin mat of bundled fabric, staring at the cracked ceiling of the underground station, listening to the sounds of restless bodies shifting in the dark. The air smelled of damp earth, rust, and unwashed skin. Lanterns cast weak halos of light over the survivors, their flickering glow making the shadows seem alive. No one truly slept down here. They closed their eyes. They rested their bodies. But no one surrendered to unconsciousness. Not when the enemy could move unseen. Not when the rules of the world had changed overnight. The woman, he still didn't know her name, sat against the wall, arms crossed, gaze unfocused. She hadn't even pretended to sleep. The girl, curled in a nest of blankets nearby, breathed evenly, but Elias doubted she was truly asleep either. Even children learn how to fake it in times like these. The only ones who slept were the ones too exhausted to fight it. Elias turned his head slightly, watching the man from earlier, the one who had recognized the danger of being seen. He sat with a group near the center of the platform, speaking in low voices. Their faces flickered between shadow and light, their expressions unreadable. There was an unspoken structure here, a fragile order. The old world systems had collapsed, but something had replaced them. It always did. Even in ruin, people formed hierarchies. Elias shifted his focus to his own hands. The bandages the woman had wrapped around his knuckles were already darkening with dry blood. He flexed his fingers, testing the pain. He could still feel the echo of the Zarathians' grip in his mind, the weight of their control pressing down. It had been so absolute, so certain, but had failed, and they had noticed. He exhaled, rolling onto his side, forcing his body to rest even if his mind refused. If the Zarathians were watching, if they were planning their next move, then he would need whatever strength he could gather. A sound cut through the stillness. Not a voice, not the shifting of bodies. Something sharper, mechanical. Elias sat up instantly, scanning the tunnel. Others stirred, the instinctive tension of hunted animals spreading through the space. The woman was already on her feet, her head tilting slightly, listening. Then a glow, not from the lanterns, from above. The station entrance, collapsed, jagged, buried beneath rubble, began to pulse with an unnatural light. A pale, pulsing blue. Not the searchlights of human technology. Something else. Something alien. Elias was already moving. So as a man from earlier, his group shifting, grabbing weapons, mostly scavenge blades and makeshift clubs, things that wouldn't matter against what was coming. But instinct drove them to prepare anyway. Then the sound changed. A low vibration. Not loud, but deep. A hum that rattled inside the bones behind the eyes. Elias's breath caught. Then silence. Not the silence of a world at rest. The silence of something waiting. A shape moved at the edge of the collapsed entrance. Not the fluid, erratic motion of the first Zarathian he had seen, but something else. Something deliberate, calculating. Then a second, a third. Elias counted 5 before he stopped counting. A chill crawled up his spine. The first Zarathian had faltered, had glitched. These did not. The man in charge shifted slightly. His voice was low but firm. They found us. The girl stiffened but did not speak. The woman beside Elias exhaled through her nose. Of course they did. A moment stretched between them. The hum in the air remained, a barely perceptible tremor inside the mind, like the moment before a storm broke. Then, the first Zarathian stepped forward. It did not walk as humans did. Its form shifted between states, not quite liquid, not quite solid, as if its body moved through space differently. Its surface was smooth, reflecting the glow of its own energy. There was no face, no mouth, no eyes. Only presence. And then, without sound, without motion, its voice entered their minds. Elias Carter. A cold weight settled in his gut. The station remained deathly still. No one breathed. The Zarathian did not turn to the others. Did not acknowledge them. Only him. Kulme. Not a command. Not quite. An invitation. Elias forced his jaw to unclench. forced himself to breathe. No. The silence deepened. The other Zarathians did not move. They waited. The first one tilted its head, as if considering something unseen. You should. Elias did not respond. The woman beside him stepped slightly closer, her posture deceptively relaxed, but he could feel the tension radiating from her. The man leading the group tensed. His voice was quiet. We have to move. Elias didn't argue. Because the Zarathians weren't attacking. Not yet. That was worse. The first one tilted its head again. Listening. Elias didn't wait to find out what it was listening for. He turned and ran. The others followed. The underground station erupted in emotion, bodies scrambling, grabbing what little they could. The tunnels ran deep, deeper than the immediate ruins. The girl had led them here for a reason. Elias didn't look back. The tunnels stretched before them, an endless maze of darkness and decay. But they had moved fast, and for the first time since the invasion began, he felt something new. Not just fear, not just survival. The Zarathians had spoken to him. Not a command, not an override, a choice. They were learning, and that meant they weren't as certain as they wanted him to believe. The tunnels stretched before them, an endless artery of darkness, pulsing with their hurried footsteps. The air was damp, thick with the scent of earth and decay, each breath tasting of rust and old stone. Water dripped from unseen cracks above, rhythmic and steady, the only sound aside from their ragged breathing. Elias ran, his body moving on instinct, his mind struggling to catch up. The others kept pace, their forms shadowed by the flickering lanterns left behind in their wake. He could hear the girl just ahead, her steps light and sure. The woman was beside him, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent too long surviving. Behind them, the rest of the group followed. Their presence felt more than seen. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The Zarathians had come, not to wipe them out, not to kill them outright, to ask. Elias's name had echoed in his head, spoken with the same cold certainty as their first command, but had not been an order. It had been a request, a negotiation. That was new. That was terrifying. The tunnels began to slope downward, curving into an old maintenance corridor. The girl veered right, leading them through a narrow passageway lined with rusted pipes and crumbling tile. Somewhere in the distance, machinery groaned, a sound of the old world, long abandoned but not entirely dead. They finally slowed. The girl reached a heavy metal door at the end of the passage, placed a hand against it, and turned to face them. Her breath came fast but controlled. They won't follow this far, she said. Elias wanted to believe her. The man who had first spoken in the underground camp, dark-eyed, sharp-featured, stepped forward. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. What the hell was that? His voice was low, controlled, but it carried weight. No one answered. Elias inhaled deeply. His chest still ached from the run, from the weight of the Zarathians' presence. He met the man's gaze. They're changing. The woman beside him scoffed, crossing her arms. And what does that mean? It means they don't understand something, Elias said. And that bothers them. The group was silent. The man exhaled sharply. They knew your name. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded. The man studied him for a long moment, then turned to the rest of the group. This doesn't change anything, he said. We keep moving. We stay underground. We stay unseen. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He understood the instinct to hide. He understood the logic. The Zarathians were an overwhelming force, a species that had cracked the code of control itself. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to disappear, to make themselves small, unimportant, unworthy of attention. But he also knew something else. They had already been seen. The girl watched the conversation unfold, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. You think hiding is going to work forever? The man stiffened. It's worked so far. The girl tilted her head. Has it? Elias turned toward her, something flickering in his chest. She was right. They had been found. The Zarathians had been precise, methodical. They had executed their invasion without chaos, without struggle. Their conquest had not been war. It had been efficiency. And yet, tonight, they had come not with force, but with words. Elias Carter. Cool, mate. They were searching. Why? Elias clenched his jaw. We need to figure out what they want. The woman shot him a look. They want control. They had control, Elias countered. And then it slipped. The man folded his arms. You think they're afraid? Elias exhaled. I think they don't like variables. A flicker of unease passed through the group. They were still standing at the door, bodies tense, waiting for some unspoken decision to be made. Finally, the man sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I don't like this. No one does, Elias said. The man studied him. Then, reluctantly, he stepped back. We get some rest. Tomorrow, we figure out our next move. Elias nodded, though sleep felt like the last thing his body would allow. The girl turned, wrenched open the metal door, and stepped inside. The rest followed. The space beyond was a maintenance bunker, small, lined with old equipment and dust-covered lockers. A few makeshift beds had been arranged along the walls, blankets piled in corners. It was cramped but secure. Elias moved toward the far wall, leaning against the cold metal. His pulse was still too fast, his body still too aware. The woman sat down across from him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, "You're thinking too much." Elias exhaled a short laugh. Wouldn't be the first time. She tilted her head. You don't strike me as a strategist. He shrugged. I'm not. She studied him. Then why do they want you? The question lingered. Elias had no answer. He had been nobody, an ordinary man in an extraordinary moment. He had resisted the Zarathians' control, but so had others. He had survived, but so had she. So had the girl. So had this group. And yet, the Zarathians had spoken his name. Elias ran a hand over his face. I don't know. The woman nodded slightly, as if she had expected that answer. Then, after a beat, she said Sarah. Elias frowned. What? My name, she said. Sarah. He blinked. Then, despite everything, despite the weight of the night, the exhaustion pressing into his bones, the reality of a world that no longer made sense, he found himself almost smiling. Elias, he said. Sarah nodded once. Then she leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes. Try to sleep, Elias. He doubted he would, because somewhere above, beneath the silent ships, the Zarathians were waiting. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which side was hunting which. Elias had expected nightmares. Instead, sleep did not come at all. He lay on his back, staring at the rusted ceiling of the bunker, listening to the rhythmic breathing of those around him. Sarah was nearby, arms folded, chin resting against her chest, but he knew she wasn't sleeping either. The girl, still nameless, still watching them all with that sharp, measuring gaze, had curled up in the corner, eyes shut but fingers twitching every so often. The others, scattered across the bunker, slept in uneasy shifts. Somewhere above, the Zarathians waited. Elias had spent the last few hours running through the same question. Why him? He had no answers. He wasn't special. He wasn't a soldier or a leader. He had no knowledge that could help humanity claw its way out of this. The only thing that set him apart was that when the Zarathians had issued their first command, he had resisted. And that had meant something. They had called his name. They had asked. A deep unease settled in his chest. The Zarathians did not negotiate. They conquered seamlessly, effortlessly. They had no reason to make offers, unless something had gone wrong. Elias sat up. Across the room, Sarah's eyes flicked toward him. Go to sleep, she muttered. Can't. Sarah exhaled, rubbing her forehead. You're going to get yourself killed thinking too hard. Probably. He stood, stretching stiff muscles. But I need to know what they want. Sarah watched him for a long moment, then sighed and stood as well. Fine. Let's figure it out. The girl stirred at the sound of movement, opening one eye. You're leaving? Elias hesitated. Sarah answered first. Not far. The girl studied them, then nodded once and closed her eyes again, retreating into her own thoughts. Elias turned toward the tunnel exit. He had no real plan, just an instinct. Sarah followed. The underground air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. They moved quietly, stepping around loose stones and rusted pipes, their breath the only sound breaking the silence. The tunnel stretched ahead, long and winding, but Elias wasn't interested in distance. He just needed space to think. Sarah broke the silence first. You think they're afraid of you? Elias shook his head. Not afraid. Uncertain. Sarah considered that. Uncertainty is dangerous for them. Yes. Then why haven't they killed you yet? That was the question, wasn't it? Elias exhaled. Maybe they can't. Sarah frowned. Can't. He turned to face her. What if whatever lets them control people, whatever gives them power, doesn't work on me? Or on you? Or on the others who resisted? Sarah crossed her arms. And if their control isn't absolute, that means it can be broken. Sarah studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, from the darkness ahead, movement. Elias froze. Sarah's hand went to the knife at her hip, muscles coiling. A shadow detached itself from the tunnel wall. Not Zarathian. Human. The man from the bunker, the one who had questioned Elias, stepped forward. You really think you can fight them? His voice was low, edged with something unreadable. Elias held his gaze. We don't have a choice. The man exhaled. You think you're important to them. They spoke to me, Elias said. That's never happened before. You know that. The man studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Then we use it. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Use it how exactly? The man's gaze darkened. We give them what they want. Elias stiffened. You want to hand me over? No, the man's voice was calm, measured. I want you to talk to them. Silence. Sarah scoffed. That's insane. It's an opportunity, the man countered. If they're changing, if they're uncertain, we need to know why. We need to understand them. Elias swallowed. His pulse pounded in his skull. It was a trap. It had to be. But the alternative? Hiding in tunnels until the Zarathians found them, anyway. Until they wiped out the last of humanity like a problem to be erased. That wasn't a future. That was waiting to lose. Elias exhaled. Ow! The man tilted his head. You already know. Elias did know. The Zarathians had called his name. They were waiting. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't ready for what happened next.